You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Today, continuing our sub-series on Indigenous women's history or herstory and current modern-day activism, we're going to focus on boarding schools and Native Americans and what went down in the 18th and 19th centuries and even the beginning of the 20th. It's quite a story. My guest for the conversation today is Brenda Child, an eminent historian who is of the Ojibwe people and who has written numerous books on the subject and has impressive and nuanced interpretations of it. And of course, there will be fighting words in the form of a poem at the end. But before we get into any of that, we need to go inside the headlines. For Western readers, Charles Dickens, the 19th century British author, was perhaps the main major portrayer of boarding schools as evil. Boarding schools constituted a nightmare residence for children. Stern, punishing headmasters and headmistresses, brutal teachers, deprivation of food and warmth, physical punishment, and all sorts of other evils accumulated on the page, and I dare say, very much in real life too, to terrify scores of us growing up. Well, certainly me. But a real history of boarding schools is no less frightening, corrupt, or cruel, and any child worth her rebellion would be wise to try and shun them. Now, with the revived interest in Native American and more broadly Indigenous history, we come smack up against boarding schools. In August, the New York Times ran a special featured series on the Native American boarding school system, wherein they wrote, "For more than 150 years, spurred by federal assimilation policies beginning in the early 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were sent to boarding schools across the country. In many cases, they were forcibly removed from their home." Close quote. Not that this was the only indignity, even atrocity, committed against the indigenous population of North America, which overall approached genocide, and in some cases did eradicate entire native nations. This was, shall we say, a subtler form of devastation, going under the euphemistic name of assimilation. Depending on location, government policy at the time, and degree of religious zealotry, the boarding school movement, through its various agents, would seize custody of children or manipulate parents into doing so, and abduct them sometimes many miles away to otherwise inaccessible locales. Parents who resisted the boarding school system could be severely punished. The mother example of 3-year-old Nushuk of the Tlingit tribe was incarcerated in 1895 after refusing to return her daughter to Douglas Island Friends Mission School, and that was a Quaker school. Well, once in the boarding school, they would cut the children's hair, of particular violating significance among certain peoples like the Lakota, assign the children new English names and prohibit them using their native names, forbid them to speak their language, practice their native religion, they were forced to attend Christian churches, and to observe their own culture, including holidays, religious and otherwise. Moreover, under the pretense of education, they would put the children to work. Now, the labor was not light and was expectedly gendered. The little boys would be sent to do farm work, leather work, repairing harnesses and saddles, to do construction work, to tend farm animals, to plant and harvest and work the fields. The little girls would be put to work doing laundry, cooking, cleaning, sewing, and so-called feminine work that would, quote, educate them for service as maids. They were frequent beatings and punishments by solitary confinement. The children often ran away, only to be tracked by professionals hired and trained to do that job, and then we were returned for further punishment. The work that the children would do sustained the institutions in which the children were being kept, and, as I've noted, also trained them for service. Both were money-making exercises. In fact, the monetization of the boarding school era was at its heart, and we'll hear more about that later. An outing program was an arrangement by which children worked as manual laborers or servants, maids, scrub women, kitchen help, in surrounding farms or at businesses like wagon makers, and the money earned went to the system, not to the individual children. That some parents managed to cleverly negotiate their way through that system and keep families relatively intact is a testament to native strategy, even at the family level. But as we'll hear later, it can be tricky even for historians to point this out, because the same games will be played against them as had happened recently with the African American community. That is, let one black historian point out that, despite the horror of slavery in every aspect, there still were some enslaved people who managed to not only survive, but after emancipation, to turn the few skills they had managed heroically to acquire while enslaved into small businesses, becoming chefs, tailors, carpenters, etc. Well, so this now could be used against them in claiming ahistorically that, well, slavery must not have been so bad after all. See, it was an education, and now you have a trade. Aren't you lucky? In other words, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Examples, taking at random from the New York Times series. James LaBelle, Inupiaq, 8 years old in 1955, whose mother was given the choice of sending him to boarding school or putting him up for adoption. He was sent to a boarding school operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in southeast Alaska, where perceived violations of school rules required that children be whipped with a cat-o'-nine-tails naked by other children, and where sexual violence against girls and sodomizing little boys was repeated and commonplace. At the Intermountain Indian School in Brigham City, Utah, children were never allowed to question being made to work as part of their school experience. A Navajo survivor, Anita Yellowhair, says, quote, "It was just what you did, there no questions asked. They hired me out on weekends to clean the homes of white families." Child labor largely constructed the Sherman Institute in Southern California in 1902. At Utah's Intermountain School, if students were caught speaking languages other than English, they were made to kneel and clean the toilets, and they were beaten regularly. Malnutrition was normal, and outbreaks like measles common, but although parents from surrounding reservations quickly would assemble to try to take their children home, children died, filling the cemeteries. In a city park north of downtown Albuquerque, workers digging irrigation trenches in the 1970s found children's bones. The site had been the cemetery of the Albuquerque Indian School. Many Indian boarding institutions changed their names, their locations, or their operators over time, making them more difficult to trace. A practice analogous to that of the Roman Catholic Church today in moving sexually abusive priests from parish to parish. A recent new accounting, the Times reports, shows that at least 523 institutions were part of the sprawling network of boarding schools for Native children. At least 408 received some federal funding. An initial report on the federal boarding school system, released by the Interior Department last year, cited more than 50 school sites known to contain burial grounds. This is not a coincidence. This is the first time in history, I will remind you, when a native person, Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, a native woman from the Laguna Pueblo people, and a former guest, I'm proud to say, on this podcast, she was ever the first ever cabinet member in charge of the Department of the Interior to be a native person. So, not a coincidence that graves have been suddenly found. Congress enacted laws to coerce parents to send their children to schools, including authorizing the Interior Department and the Interior Department's officials to withhold treaty-guaranteed food rations to families who had treaty guarantees. Congress also funded schools through annual appropriations and with money from the sale of lands, wait for it, held by tribes. And then, in addition, the government hired Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Congregationist associations to run schools, regardless of whether they had experience in education, and paid them an amount for each student. In recent years, tribal nations around the USA have begun using technologies like remote sensing surveys and ground-penetrating radar to locate evidence of burial sites. In July, the Paiute above Utah, it's a tribe above Utah, confirmed that 12 children's bodies buried in unmarked graves had been found at the site of the Panguitch Indian boarding school in southern Utah. At least 86 students are thought to have died at the Genoa Indian Industrial School, in Nebraska, about 90 miles west of Omaha, from causes including typhoid, malnutrition, tuberculosis, and a shooting. But generally, as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs said in 1891, quote, "It was cheaper to educate Indians than to kill them." Period. Close quote. It's time for our first break, but I'll return in just a moment with the conversation. Again, this week, Brenda Child, the historian. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Dr. Brenda J. Child was born in 1959 and is an Ojibwe historian and author. She was born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota and is a citizen of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa, as well as being an academic. She received a Bachelor of Arts in History and Social Studies from Bemidji State University, a Master of Arts in History from the University of Iowa, and a Doctor of Philosophy in History from the University of Iowa. She is Northrop Professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. Her scholarship, focusing on American Indian history, including the legacy of American Indian boarding schools in the United States, and the role of Ojibwe women in preserving culture, indigenous education, social history, and the historical legacy of the jingle dress. She is the author of award-winning books of American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, which won the North American Indian Prose Award, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, Indian Subjects, Hemispheric Perspectives on the History of Indigenous Education, and her 2014 book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, won the American Indian Book Award and the Best Book in Midwestern History. Her book for children, Bow Wow Pow Wow, won the American Indian Youth Literature Award for Best Picture Book. She served as president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association from 2017 to 2018. There are numerous other awards and presentations that she has received and done, but why not cut to the chase? Here is Brenda Child. Brenda, as I've just been told I may call you, welcome to Women's Media Center Live. It's good to have you here.
I'm happy to be with you.
Well, you are the reigning expert on Native American suffering through the boarding schools. Most Americans don't know about this history. It's been buried along with most other truths about this country. And I would like you to, give us some of those basics. They were run for the government, who the churches that were behind them, the money that was behind them, etc.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me to your program and for also doing a program about a topic that those of us who work in my field, which is American Indian history and Indigenous studies, think is a really important one.
It is.
So going back and looking at the history, and I will say that kind of my expertise is, we're all kind of specialists as American, historians. We all sort of specialize, just like medical doctors specialize.
I see.
And I have focused on American Indian people who attended government boarding schools in the late 19th and the early 20th century in the United States. Now, one of the interesting things about boarding school history, in fact, I'm doing a panel at the University of Minnesota on Monday where people are talking about boarding schools under Franco in Spain, Turkish boarding schools.
Oh my God.
And so it seems like I feel like I'm still in a stage where I'm learning about more comparative work on Indigenous studies. But it seems like people always have the same bad ideas.
I was just going to say,
circulate them around the globe.
Well,
right?
fascists do. They share.
Yes, true. So boarding schools in the United States were, a part of government assimilation programs that really date from the late 19th century. And the first government boarding school established was one kind of famous. It was called Carlisle in Pennsylvania, and it was established in 1879. Now, I know that people think historians like to fixate on dates, and I don't always fixate on dates, but I myself do date the boarding school era from Carlisle in 1879, and I usually end it in the 1930s when FDR was elected, because at that time, the federal government had kind of turned away from the boarding school concept. And I'll explain why in a minute. It's not necessarily for humanitarian reasons that they turned away from boarding school. But in the 1930s, people began to say, well, why can't Indians attend public school? And so that's what happened under FDR. So I usually think about Carlisle up until FDR in the 1930s. And so it's really a half century that Indian education dominates federal policy making toward Indian people in the United States. But I will also say, again, think about 1879. What's going on with Indian people? Well, the United States is still engaged in many regions on the northern and southern plains. They're involved in warfare against Indian tribes, right? And so some of the early students who go off to the Carlisle School were the children whose families were involved in military conflict against the United States.
The enemy.
And so down in Florida, for example, in St. Augustine, Florida, this is where the United States had incarcerated the Apache people, Geronimo's people, essentially, who were involved in a large military resistance movement. So the Indian Wars were wars on families and communities, right? That's the nature of that kind of warfare at the time. And so whole families were incarcerated in St. Augustine, Florida. And so the Carlisle School took the children of the Apache prisoners of war, and other children came to the school on trains from areas out west because and so some of the earliest children at Carlisle were the children of American Indian prisoners of war.
Oh, God. So we not only, quote, defeat you, largely through disease, I might add, being spread, but also through military action. But we take your children and we, quote, heavy quotes, assimilate them.
Right.
They make money for us. We put them to work. We it was like 150 years almost, wasn't it? I mean, and it was at least 500 institutions.
The boarding school era, and I see that you might be referring to the New York Times story.
Yes,
What I'm suggesting is that the heyday of government boarding schools, and I'm talking about government schools, right? Not any church school that operated, or where I'm from in northern Minnesota, it was largely Catholic institutions and Episcopal who came out and missionized Indians. I'm not really talking about any kind of school that opened their doors to Indian people. I'm talking specifically about the government schools that operated for that half century, beginning during the Indian Wars and continuing up until 1934, during FDR, when FDR and the new people in the Indian office began closing down the boarding school institution, having turned away from that idea. And I'll kind of explain, if you don't mind, why I see the idea is kind of passé in the 1930s.
Doesn't seem to need an explanation to me, but maybe you should explain.
I should explain, because it was kind of when you mention money and what does the United States have to gain from, we think putting kids in government boarding schools.
No, they put them to work.
Put them to work, but it was also a time in the history of the United States when there was a big dramatic land policy called the Dawes Act of 1887. And so you have Indians kind of going off to federal boarding schools in the late 19th century, but it really goes hand in hand, this policy, with the land policies toward Indians of the late 19th century. So the boarding school era kind of follows the treaty era, when a lot of tribes had negotiated quite a bit of real estate to be handed over to the United States. At the same time, Indian people were still in possession of quite a bit of land, mostly in the Midwest and the western states. But the United States was interested in those lands. And so boarding schools were kind of part of those assimilation policies. The idea was that children can go off to boarding schools. We're going to give you these wonderful education for your children, because they're not going to really need a homeland anymore. They can enter American society and become citizens now, because the land and the dispossession is another round of dispossession is taking place. So this is, if I'm going to make one point to you today, which I make one point sometimes in talking to my students, remember that 50-year period that I'm calling the boarding school era is also a time when 90 million acres of land passed out of Indian ownership to the United States.
What do you know?
And one of the largest dispossessions in the history of the world took place during the boarding school era. So FDR and his progressive reformers come along, they say, well, Indians can go to public schools, speak their language, let's protect their religious rights, because those things aren't really threatening to the United States anymore. The big land grab had already taken place in the previous half century.
What was the big land grab called?
Well, like I say, it was touched off by this Dawes Allotment Act. So when Indian people moved on to reservations, they, in a sense, continued their traditional systems of land tenure. But the government said, why don't we parcel the land up into individual acres? Indians can live as small landowners, become farmers in the American style. Yeah. But what happened was a massive dispossession as those policies were amended in various ways. Oh. And so everybody was supposed to get a little piece of land, but a lot of people were dispossessed of their land during that time. Of course. And I'll just give you a quick example. My grandfather, in fact, was forced out of his community in central Minnesota because that was a beautiful area with lakes and forests and such. Sure. And he took an allotment up on the White Earth Reservation, where here in Minnesota, where I live and teach, they wanted all the Ojibways to live on one reservation. And then all of those other reservations could be ceded to the United States. Oh. It's not what happened, but it's what they wanted to have happen. God. So my grandfather moved away with his brother and father and took an allotment at White Earth. Well, my grandfather did not speak English, and he did not pay taxes on his land. And so that land was confiscated by the state of Minnesota for non-payment of taxes eventually. And my grandfather, and then later on, the court cases that emerged in the 20th century about that dispossession said that, well, that was illegal. The state of Minnesota had no right to tax that Indian land to begin with. But yet he was dispossessed of his land. Yeah, that's after the fact. And so decades after the fact.
So many Native American families sort of willingly sent their children off to boarding schools, hoping that they'd have better future opportunities. And because it seemed that this was they didn't know that what they were in effect doing was ceding their children, sometimes even ceding custody of their children.
Well, I would say that Indian people, and I think we should never underestimate American Indian families and parents, I think they were making strategic decisions about their children at the time. Sometimes kids ended up in boarding schools because their parents had died. In fact, I believe the number one reason kids ended up in boarding school was death of the mother. And so think about an era of tuberculosis, contagious disease.
Oh, of
Sometimes
course.
family structures in this new era of poverty and dispossession for Indian people kind of failed families. Wow. And so sometimes that's why kids ended up in boarding schools. At the same time, parents were making strategic decisions about their children's future. So remember when I described how there were the Indian Wars were taking place when Carlisle was established. So imagine you feel like there's going to be military conflict where you live in North Dakota, South Dakota, right? This is before Wounded Knee even happened, right? When Carlisle's established. And so think about what decisions you might make for your child's well-being.
Of course.
Maybe you want your kid to go off to school, and maybe you think it's even good for them to learn English or to get an education or be trained for a job. Or maybe you just want a safe place for your child. Right. And so those are the kinds of things that we have to imagine. It's not always that Indian people are being duped into sending their children. They're making strategic decisions about their own survival and the survival of their children.
Of course.
And sometimes during this half century of boarding schools, parents and community members decided for whatever reason to send their child to boarding school. Right? So it's not like, I have the whole array of choices and this is option number 5, right?
Right. No, of
They're
course
making
not. No, of
decisions
course not.
about survival
Of
for the
course.
well-being of their families
And
and children.
And I know that it ranged all the way from from their making strategic decisions to forced removal. I mean, in other words, it was every shade in between must have been at some point used by parents or been used on parents.
Well, what we remember about our American history in the 19th century is that we had compulsory attendance laws across the United States, right?
Yep.
And so what if you lived out on the Navajo reservation in rural Arizona?
Mm-hmm.
Where are you going to send your kid to school when you have to send your child to school someplace, right?
Yeah.
And even Minnesota, where I live, can be, what if you live 15 miles away from school?
Of course.
And it's winter, right? We have pretty big snowfalls here.
Right.
So sometimes people made decisions about school so their kids could have a steady place to go to school,
right,
when there weren't always yet this infrastructure of kind of public schools that were available to them.
Yep. Oh, God. But sometimes, I was just looking at another clip, the mother of 3-year-old Nushuk of the Tlingit tribe was incarcerated in 1895 after refusing to return her daughter to Douglas Island Friends Mission School. And that was a Quaker school, which you'd think would be one of the better ones. But tell me, Brenda, what on the whole was, well, better is a strange term, but was more preferable? I would tend to think that government schools, your specialty, would be preferable to religious schools because religion can be such a bludgeon. But were they better, or were they the same, or were they worse, or does it not matter?
I guess I would say that I would hate to, exactly weigh in and say this is a better institution, better than that one.
No, of course not.
But what I will say, because I've just studied the government boarding schools, I haven't really ever spent time with records of the religious organizations. But one thing I will mention, that sometimes I think we want to keep clear our history of the United States and how it may be different from policies like in Canada, because a lot of the stories that we've been hearing in recent years have come out of the Canadian residential school history, where there has been a big national dialogue in that country about forced assimilation and about the residential schools. But one big difference in Indian education between the U.S. and Canada was that Canada farmed out Indian education to the religious denominations. And for the most part, we did not do that in the United States. There was a federal government boarding school program that began with Carlisle, and the employees were kind of employees of the U.S. Indian Service. And so we didn't really farm out Indian education to church organizations in the same way that Canada did. And so that makes our history a little bit different. And I will say one other area of difference between the U.S. and Canada involving the history of schools is, for example, my great-grandfather and my grandmother attended government boarding schools. My grandfather went to that Carlisle school in Pennsylvania. My grandmother went to the Flandreau Indian School in South Dakota in the 1920s. Now, I always think that they're interesting people because they came back to the reservation, resumed speaking Ojibwe, raised their families in the Ojibwe language. So I feel very lucky with my own family.
Yes.
But in Canada, Indigenous education in residential schools continued for another half century, right? So I'm talking about my grandparents and not my mother, who went to a day school on the reservation. But people my age in Canada often went to residential schools because it continued for another half century. And I'm suggesting to you in the United States that the government boarding schools declined in the 1930s under FDR. But in Canada, they kept on for another 50 years. And so in a sense, their memories are stronger and fresher, right? Because that boarding school generations that I'm talking about have largely passed on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, apparently, if about 100 or 250 of the boarding schools in the United States were religious, and there were 500 or so, that leaves the majority of schools being government schools, doesn't it?
Well, what it leaves is the schools that I studied were these, say, 25 or so boarding schools that operated during that half century of the late 19th, early 20th century during the allotment era. And there were 25 of those schools that were off-reservation federal schools. There were schools on reservations as well. And we had one of those. We had actually two of those at Red Lake, because what the federal government planned, even though this structure was not necessarily complete at the time they thought of it, but reformers and policymakers thought that Indian people could go to school at home up until the time they were about 12 years old. So it's almost like getting your basic primary school education in your home community. And then when they're about 12, go off to an off-reservation school, one of these 25 schools like Carlisle, Haskell in Kansas, Flandreau, the one that my grandmother went to. Yeah. And then they were all the way over to Oklahoma and in California, Oregon, right? They were, these 25 schools were across the United States. And so the schools that I've studied are just these federal off-reservation boarding schools that operated during the 50 years that assimilation and the allotment policy, the corresponding land policies dominated. I think when you look at that New York Times story, they're kind of counting up any kind of institution that may have opened their doors to Indian people. And I'm kind of overwhelmed by, I can't contemplate or even count, schools everywhere that any religious denomination opened and that continued. But I'm suggesting to you that for a half century, this policy dominated Indian policymaking toward tribes in the United States. And it was of the late 19th and early 20th century. That's not to say that there weren't schools that opened
I
their
understand.
doors to Indians that continued. But it's like, when does this policy, which we're including you have to go away, you have to go to attend an off-reservation school. And during this time that the corresponding land policies were dispossessing Indians is that half century.
Right. No, I understand that part. Yeah. Let me ask you this. Since this was a matter of policy, and then did Congress and the government have more of a say in those schools than in the religious schools that they, for whatever reasons, meted out?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm looking at one bit here that says Congress enacted laws to coerce Native parents to send their children to schools, including authorizing Interior Department officials to withhold treaty-guaranteed food rations to families who resisted. And it funded schools through annual appropriations and with money from the sale of lands held by tribes. Yeah. That's a damned if you do, damned if you don't, because we gobble up your land and then we take the money that that's a killer, isn't it?
Well, I like to say, with Indian people, we paid for our own dispossession, right?
Yeah.
So if the government is going to come out and survey Indian land.
Damn right. Wow.
We paid for that, right? We paid and we paid and we paid.
Yeah.
And even the kids who were in the federal boarding schools, the girls sewed the uniforms. They ran the kitchens. The boys worked the school farms and milked the cows.
Oh, yeah. Right? They did the washrooms, they did the laundries. They did the whole...
Yeah, they performed the labor that kept these institutions running.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, God. And the children, the effect on the children of being taken away from your family. The effect on the children of having your hair cut off and not being allowed to use your native language and worship in the way that you choose and wear what you choose and celebrate holidays the way that you. I mean, the heart just bleeds for those kids.
It does. It does. But I will also say that those were policies of the reservation system at the same time. There was no escaping these policies for Indian people. It wasn't something just happened when you went to boarding school, right? And I kind of I'm writing a new book now about the history of American Indian marriage, which has been a really great topic. But I kind of talk about, I was kind of motivated because I learned more about my grandparents and because of records I found in our community. And what I found is that my grandparents, when they were married in the 1920s, like most people, were thinking of building a home and having children.
Sure.
And, they were at that stage of their life. They had to get married in a Christian church ceremony.
Oh, God.
In order to get a home loan on the reservation.
Oh.
Right? To buy the lumber.
Well, there's a crossover.
And so, right. So what I'm saying is it isn't just boarding schools. It's the whole reservation system of the late 19th and early 20th century that where Native people were navigating these new systems of surveillance, survival under these conditions. And so the reservation system in people's own homes, right, also continued these same policies. It's not just the kids at school.
No.
It's the day-to-day lived experience of Indian people on reservations.
Well,
in this late 19th and early 20th century. Boarding school is just one part of it.
You know that feminists always say patriarchy begins at home.
Right.
And,
right.
So whether a home is on the reservation or in a, 2x4 or in a cottage somewhere, there's patriarchy. It doesn't matter the system.
There's patriarchy, and there's also a lot of that on the reservation because boarding schools is one part of policing that, but people didn't understand how Native people worked, right? And so, for example, in Ojibwe culture, here in the Great Lakes, women were in charge of the wild rice harvest, for example, which is a really important part of our annual economy.
Right.
And when, Americans came in here, they didn't understand women doing physical labor like that. They're supposed to be home and domestic.
Sure, of course.
And so there's lots of ways that, they intruded and kind of Western ideas about domesticity almost intruded on Native people. Some of it was through the boarding schools, but some of it was just through the surveillance of Indian people and trying to change their life ways on reservations too.
Of course.
All the way down to the kind of work that men and women performed.
Of course. Yeah. No, and you send the boys out to work for whatever local farms they're making harnesses and they're making shoes and they're farming, and the girls are happening to be cooking and baking and doing laundry work and sewing and that's cultural seepage. And I would
also say that it's kind of when you think of the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States is industrializing. We're kind of moving away from that old style, small agriculture, way of living.
Right.
And so the boarding schools is also giving Native people, they pretend that it's the latest in training, but it's really very old-fashioned kind of labor as the U.S. is industrializing and urbanizing.
Of course it is. Yeah, I don't see a lot of industrialized jobs happening out of the boarding schools. Oh, God, this is so... It's heartbreaking because it's quite sophisticated, the oppression and the fight back too.
Well, and one thing, I really like that point, because one thing we never have to forget, and this is, if I came away from doing this research, which I began a long time ago, with one overriding idea about the whole boarding school era, is never underestimate American Indian families or American even children even, because the children in the schools were very rebellious.
Yes.
They ran away from school. They were rebellious, and there was even boarding school arson wasn't unknown. and so the spirit of people, and what I was able to see when I wrote my book, Boarding School Seasons, because I use letters that students and family members wrote to one another, I was able to see the ties that continued. So again, imagine you send your kids away for 4 years and you're not supposed to see them, or they're not supposed to come home. Do you quit being a parent? What do you do? Yeah. Well, what Indian parents did was they wrote to their children. They stayed in touch. If they thought their child was sick, they wrote to the school, right? So Indian families, they
found ways.
I mean, they found ways, in very admirable ways. And they continued to be parents, and they continued to be families, even through this very difficult time.
Oh, it's fascinating, the research that you do. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. No, I'm very grateful to you for joining us. The work is remarkable. Thank you so much, Brenda, for being with us. And you have to come back soon and talk more with us. How about that?
Especially when my new book on the history of American Indian marriage comes out.
Oh, yeah. That sounds like a feminist book to me. When does that come out?
It will be.
When does that come out?
Well, I'm still working on it, but I'll let you know when it's out, because I'm hoping that it's in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Well, there's a way in which sometimes I think that your average non-Indian person sentimentalizes and glamorizes and does this whole sort of, oh, they're so special and so beautiful, and sort of hug a tree kind of thing about Native peoples, which of course is partly true, but is also partly not true, because people are people. Right. And it usually drives me nuts. It's because it's so sentimentalizing, and it's only since I've been doing this series that I've come across more Native people like you, who in fact are tired of the buttons and the beads and the drums and want some real accounting done. About the reality that Native families in this country face and have faced and continue to face. So I thank you again, and the work you're doing sounds absolutely wonderful. So be sure and tell us about it, okay? So that when that book is done, you have to come back.
I will indeed.
Thanks again for being with us on Women's Media Center Live. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
It's time for our final break. But in a moment, I'll return with some fighting words in the shape of a poem. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Sometimes memories are accessible only through poetry. Are those fighting words or words of remembrance? This poem addresses the issue of children harmed. We've spent most of this episode talking about the harm done children. This is another kind of harm done. It's a poem called The Taxidermist, and it's in Harvesting Darkness, the new book of poems. The Taxidermist. She wore open-toed alligator shoes, swung a python skin purse, She stuffed the child skillfully, to keep, to hold, to treasure, to display. Small, fluffy ermine, eternally in mid-snarl, the child was so packed with her love it was doomed forever to lack even the peace of being forgotten. The child lived skinned, stripped, ignorant, hollowed of everything but that old poisonous gas its creator called love. Well aware such a creature, this lifelike, would be all the buzz, in demand by collectors. And, gathering dust, so I was. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on social media at The Robin Morgan. You can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net, and you can find my new novel, Parallax, and my just-out new book of poems, Harvesting Darkness, wherever books are sold. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer, as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer for this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us next time on Women's Media Center Live.